The expression on Richard's face when I slid the ownership certificates across our kitchen table, mere seconds after he'd proudly announced he was leaving me for his 29-year-old executive assistant, was like watching someone's entire world collapse in slow motion. It's a moment that still brings me a quiet satisfaction even now, 5 years later. My name is Victoria Adler, and for 30 years of marriage, I had methodically become the majority owner of the very real estate empire my husband believed was exclusively his creation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This photograph was taken almost 35 years ago. Me at 27, standing beside Richard at the opening of our first property. Look at that hopeful smile. I had just left a promising position at an investment firm to join my husband's fledgling real estate venture, bringing financial expertise he desperately needed but would gradually come to minimize. Though the sign behind us read, Adler Properties, Richard had already begun referring to it as his company in conversations with investors. A subtle distinction that would prove remarkably short-sighted in the decades to come. I grew up in a practical household where my mother managed our family's accounting practice after my father developed early-onset Parkinson's. Always secure your own position, Victoria, she would remind me while teaching me financial principles at our dining room table. Men see what's presented on the surface, but your security depends on what you build beneath their notice. Those words would become my guiding principle in ways neither of us could have imagined when I was just a teenager absorbing her lessons. I met Richard during my final year at Westlake Business School, where I was completing my finance degree, with highest honors. He was 5 years older, charismatic, and full of ambitious plans to revolutionize commercial real estate development in our region. What he possessed in vision and persuasiveness, he lacked in financial discipline and strategic planning, precisely the skills I had refined through my education and early career. We married 6 months after graduation, combining his entrepreneurial drive with my financial acumen. Richard had just purchased his first distressed commercial property using a loan secured through family connections. I developed the renovation budget, created the financial projections that attracted initial investors, and established the accounting systems that would support future growth. While I viewed our efforts as complementary contributions to a shared vision, Richard increasingly positioned himself as the visionary with the supportive wife who's good with numbers. This dynamic became painfully clear during our first major investor meeting. Despite the fact that I had prepared the entire financial presentation, Richard redirected all substantive questions to himself, often providing answers I had prepared for him the previous evening. When one investor specifically asked about my professional background, Richard smoothly interjected, "Victoria handles our bookkeeping while I manage the actual business decisions." That evening, I confronted him about the dismissive characterization. His response was both revealing and prophetic. Investors respond to clear leadership, Victoria. They want to know there's one decisive person steering the ship. It's just optics. You know how valuable you are. But did he really? That question lingered as our company expanded from a single property to a growing portfolio. While Richard focused on acquisition and public relations, areas where his charisma served him well, I developed the financial infrastructure, risk management systems, and strategic planning processes that enabled sustainable growth. A pattern emerged. Richard would receive public recognition for successful projects that I had largely structured and executed behind the scenes. By our 10th anniversary, when Adler Properties had grown to include 12 commercial developments, I made a pivotal decision. Rather than continuing to invest my expertise solely into building Richard's perceived empire, I would begin establishing my own position within the company structure. Not through title or public recognition, which Richard jealously guarded as his domain, but through carefully acquired ownership. My opportunity came during our 15th year of marriage, when Richard decided to restructure the company to facilitate more aggressive expansion. Focused on the prestige of establishing regional offices in 3 states, he delegated the financial details to me with minimal oversight. "Just make sure the ownership structure preserves my position as founder and CEO," he instructed before leaving for a 3-week property scouting trip with his leadership team. What Richard failed to review in the restructuring documents was the creation of a separate investment entity called Monarch Ventures, named for the butterflies my grandmother had taught me to appreciate during childhood summers at her cottage. As he signed the paperwork, barely glancing at the technical details, Richard maintained majority control of Adler Properties, but Monarch Ventures secured an initial 18% ownership position that could increase over time through specific investment provisions. For the next 15 years, as Adler Properties expanded across the region, I methodically strengthened Monarch Ventures' position through strategic investments at key moments. Each time the company needed additional capital for expansion, I ensured my separate entity participated in the financing. Each restructuring to accommodate growth included provisions that incrementally increased Monarch's ownership stake. The arrangements were entirely legal, documented in paperwork that Richard consistently signed with minimal review, dismissing what he called administrative housekeeping. Richard's awareness of my involvement remained superficial at best. He vaguely understood that I had invested some of our personal funds into the company, but never grasped the extent or strategic nature of these investments. "Victoria has her little investment project," he once told our chief financial officer within my hearing. "It keeps her occupied while we handle the real growth strategy." The CFO, Jonathan Miller, who had worked closely with me for over a decade and understood exactly how substantial my little project had become, maintained professional composure while catching my eye with a knowing glance. Jonathan was one of very few people who understood the true ownership distribution of Adler Properties, and his silent acknowledgement of my strategy had provided occasional validation during years of working in Richard's shadow. By our 25th anniversary, Monarch Ventures had acquired 42% of Adler Properties, while Richard's personal ownership had diluted to 45% through various transactions he hadn't bothered to understand when approving them. The remaining shares were distributed among minor investors and executives who had no knowledge of my connection to Monarch Ventures. The company, now with properties in 7 states and a reputation for innovative commercial development, had become a significant regional player, largely through financial and strategic systems I had established and maintained. The first warning, signs of Richard's wandering attention, appeared during our 28th year of marriage. Business trips grew longer, weekend work became more frequent, and his enthusiasm about his new executive assistant's capabilities seemed excessive for someone in an administrative support role. Melissa Barrett had joined the company at 27 with a marketing background and remarkable skill at making Richard feel even more impressive than he already considered himself. By our 30th anniversary, a milestone, Richard suggested we celebrate later in the year, due to an essential business conference that happened to include Melissa. I had increased Monarch Ventures' ownership to 49.8% through strategic transactions during the company's latest expansion phase. Richard's personal stake had reduced to 41%, though his controlling influence remained intact through voting arrangements he believed were permanent, but which contained contingencies he had never bothered to review. The culmination came. 3 months later, Richard arrived home unusually early one Tuesday evening, appearing both uncomfortable and strangely animated. He suggested we sit in the formal living room, a space we rarely used except for entertaining, rather than the comfortable family room where I had been reviewing quarterly financial statements. "Victoria, we need to discuss our future," he began with practiced solemnity. I set aside my reading glasses as he delivered what was clearly a rehearsed speech about different directions and growing apart, eventually arriving at his actual point. He had developed feelings for Melissa, who truly understands the real me, and they had decided to build a life together. "I'll be generous in the settlement, of course," he assured me, shifting to what he clearly considered the business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Portion of this personal transaction: the house, appropriate maintenance support, your personal investments, all taken care of. Melissa and I thought it might be easier if I moved out this weekend. His confidence was absolute. In his mind, he controlled all meaningful assets, and his generosity would determine my financial future. The company, his company as he had always framed it, would naturally remain under his control while I received whatever portion he deemed appropriate for my years of support. That sounds very organized, I replied calmly, surprised by my own composure in the face of this betrayal. Before you finalize these arrangements, though, there's something you should know about the company ownership structure. Richard's expression registered momentary confusion before settling into condescending patience. The corporate structure is quite complicated, Victoria. I don't think we need to get into those details right now. Actually, Richard, those details are quite relevant, I continued, retrieving a folder I had begun preparing months earlier, when Melissa's expanding role made Richard's intentions increasingly clear, particularly regarding who has authority to determine the financial aspects of our separation. His confusion deepened as I opened the folder containing comprehensive documentation of Monarch Ventures' ownership position, my legal control of that entity, and the triggering conditions in Richard's employment contract that would activate upon divorce under certain circumstances. Conditions he had approved years earlier without reading the legal fine print. This is documentation confirming that I currently control 49.8% of Adler Properties compared to your 41%, I explained matter-of-factly. And this section outlines the contingency clause that transfers voting control upon dissolution of our marriage under circumstances involving workplace relationships. Richard's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief as he processed information that completely contradicted his understanding of our respective positions. This can't be right, he insisted, scanning documents that were clearly authentic. Monarch Ventures is one of our investment partners. Monarch Ventures is me, Richard, I clarified. It has been for 15 years. Through every expansion, acquisition, and restructuring, you approved without reading the details. The color drained from his face as the implications became clear. The company he had always presented as his singular achievement, the foundation of his professional identity and the asset he assumed he would control in our divorce, was legally under my authority. The entire narrative he had constructed about our professional relationship had just collapsed. You've been planning this, he finally managed, his voice hollow. All these years you've been setting me up. No, Richard. I've been protecting myself while you took credit for my work, I corrected gently. There's a significant difference. Richard stood abruptly and paced across the living room, stopping at the large window overlooking the garden I had meticulously maintained while he traveled to industry events where he was celebrated as a self-made success. What exactly do you want? He finally asked, still facing away from me. Is this about money? A bigger settlement? The question revealed how fundamentally he still misunderstood the situation. Even now, he believed this was a negotiation tactic rather than the culmination of decades of strategic positioning. This isn't about extracting concessions, Richard, I replied, gathering the documents back into their folder with deliberate precision. This is about acknowledging the actual power dynamics in our relationship, both personal and professional. I don't need to negotiate for what I already legally control. He turned back toward me, his expression hardening into something more calculated. The strategic assessment he applied to business challenges. You realize this will damage the company, he stated flatly. A public fight for control during divorce. Proceedings will tank the stock value and frighten investors. Which is precisely why there won't be a public fight, I replied calmly. The transition documentation is already prepared. You'll announce your early retirement due to personal reasons, and I'll step in as chairperson while the board conducts a formal search for new executive leadership. You've thought of everything, he said, a grudging acknowledgement in his voice. I've had 30 years of watching you take credit for my thinking, Richard. It tends to sharpen one's strategic planning skills. The silence that followed was heavy, with 3 decades of unspoken truths. Richard had built his identity around being the visionary business leader, the self-made success. Discovering that his dismissed wife had quietly become his majority shareholder challenged not just his immediate plans, but his entire self-concept. "And Melissa?" he finally asked, revealing his priorities even in this moment of personal and professional crisis. "Ms. Barrett will be transferred to our Denver office effective immediately," I replied evenly. "Her continuing employment will depend entirely on her professional conduct and performance, not her personal relationships." Richard's face tightened. "You can't dictate who I'm not dictating your personal choices," I interrupted. "I'm establishing appropriate corporate boundaries as the controlling shareholder. What you do in your private life after our divorce is your business. Who holds management positions in the company is mine." The ringing doorbell interrupted our standoff. Richard glanced toward the entryway with visible confusion. We rarely received unannounced visitors, particularly on weekday evenings. "That would be Eleanor Blackwell," I explained, rising to answer the door. "My attorney. I thought it would be efficient to begin the separation agreement documentation immediately. You invited your lawyer here now?" Richard's stunned expression suggested he was still struggling to grasp how thoroughly I had prepared for this moment. "Actually, she's both my personal attorney and outside counsel for Monarch Ventures," I clarified. "Given the complexity of our situation, her presence will ensure all actions are properly documented from the outset." As I walked to the door, leaving Richard standing speechless in our formal living room, I felt an unfamiliar sense of visible authority replacing the hidden power I had cultivated for decades. The company I had helped build while being systematically minimized was now formally under my control, and the husband who had dismissed my contributions was facing the consequences of that prolonged underestimation. The patient strategy my mother had taught me so many years ago, building security beneath the surface while others focused on appearances, had created a foundation strong enough to withstand this personal betrayal. Richard had spent 30 years believing the narrative he had created about our respective contributions. Now he would confront the reality I had methodically documented throughout those same 30 years. Eleanor Blackwell cut an imposing figure as she entered our living room. At 62, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated high-stakes business transactions for decades. Her silver hair was cropped in a precise bob, and her charcoal suit projected professional authority without ostentation. As one of the region's most respected corporate attorneys, her presence alone communicated the seriousness of the situation. "Mr. Adler," she acknowledged Richard with professional courtesy before setting her leather briefcase on the coffee table. "I understand this is a difficult moment, but addressing the formal arrangements promptly will benefit all parties." Richard had retreated to the bar in the corner of our living room, pouring himself a generous scotch with visibly unsteady hands. "I didn't agree to any meeting," he stated flatly, attempting to reclaim some authority in a situation rapidly spiraling beyond his control. "Your agreement isn't required," Eleanor replied evenly, removing documents from her briefcase. "As Mrs. Adler has likely explained, the contingency provisions in your employment contract and the company's operating agreement have been triggered by today's developments." I watched Richard's face as the reality of his position continued to register. For 30 years, he had functioned with absolute certainty of his dominance in our relationship, both personal and professional. That certainty was now collapsing in real time as Eleanor methodically laid out separation documents, interim management agreements, and board communication drafts on our coffee table. "As you'll see, Mr. Adler, these terms are quite reasonable. Given the circumstances, Eleanor explained in her characteristic direct manner. You'll transition to emeritus status with appropriate benefits and a board observer role, though without voting authority. Mrs. Adler will assume chairperson responsibilities while maintaining majority shareholder position through Monarch Ventures. Richard stared at the documents without touching them. And if I contest this arrangement? His voice carried a dangerous edge, the tone he typically used when negotiating with contractors who challenged his terms. Eleanor's expression remained professionally neutral. Contesting would trigger the moral conduct clauses in your employment contract, potentially resulting in termination without benefits. Additionally, given your relationship with a subordinate employee, litigation would likely involve discovery, processes that would be uncomfortable for all parties. The clinical precision with which she outlined the consequences of resistance seemed to finally penetrate Richard's shock. He had spent decades navigating business negotiations from positions of power, but now found himself without viable countermoves. I need time to review this with my own counsel, he finally said, the businessman in him asserting one last attempt at procedural delay. Of course, I agreed. You have until tomorrow afternoon. The board has been called for an emergency session at 3 p.m. to address leadership transition concerns. His head snapped up. The board meeting is already scheduled? Before I've even agreed to anything? The meeting was called to address legitimate governance concerns raised by significant shareholders, Eleanor clarified. Your personal decisions have created potential liabilities that the board must address regardless of your preferences about timing. As Eleanor gathered her materials to leave, promising to return the following day for the signed documents, the full implications of the situation seemed to finally register with Richard. His carefully planned exit, leaving his aging wife while maintaining control of the company and starting a new life with his young assistant, had collapsed entirely, replaced by a humiliating reality in which he had lost control of both the narrative and the company he believed was unquestionably his. After Eleanor departed, Richard retreated to his home office without further discussion. Through the closed door, I could hear him making phone calls, likely to his personal attorney and possibly to Melissa, though I chose not to speculate on those conversations. What mattered was that the careful groundwork I had laid over decades had created a position of strength precisely when I needed it most. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. The uncertainty about Richard's growing relationship with Melissa had created a constant underlying tension. Now, with everything in the open and my position secured, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Whatever emotional turmoil lay ahead in dismantling 30 years of marriage, I would face it from a position of security and control. The following morning brought the first test of our new reality. I had risen early, as was my habit, and was reviewing final documentation for the board meeting when Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in his usual impeccable business attire, but with visible signs of a sleepless night. I spoke with Melissa last night, he announced without preamble, pouring himself coffee from the pot I had prepared. She's refusing the Denver transfer. That's certainly her prerogative, I replied calmly. Her letter of resignation will be accepted immediately with standard non-compete provisions enforced. Richard's expression tightened. She's planning to accompany me to the board meeting this afternoon to address these changes directly. This was an unexpected development, though not entirely surprising given Melissa's ambition and Richard's likely misrepresentation of his continuing authority. I considered my response carefully before replying. Melissa is a mid-level marketing executive without board access privileges. Her presence would be inappropriate for a governance discussion. I met Richard's gaze directly. However, if you're determined to create a public confrontation, I should note that I've prepared comprehensive documentation detailing questionable expense allocations and potential conflicts of interest regarding her rapid promotion path and compensation adjustments. The implied threat was clear without being explicit. Pushing this into open conflict would result in revelations that would damage both Richard's reputation and Melissa's career prospects well beyond Adler Properties. "This isn't over, Victoria," Richard said quietly, though the resignation in his voice suggested he recognized the futility of immediate resistance. "On the contrary," I replied, gathering my materials into the leather portfolio my mother had given me on my 60th birthday. "After 30 years of working in your shadow while building my own position, things are just beginning." Richard left for the office without further discussion, presumably to prepare Melissa for the reality neither of them had anticipated when plotting their future together. I spent the morning coordinating with Eleanor and finalizing my presentation for the board. A strange calm replaced the uncertainty that had shadowed so much of my married life. By early afternoon, Eleanor confirmed that Richard had signed the separation agreement with minimal modification, a pragmatic acceptance of his limited options given the comprehensive legal foundation we had established. The board meeting would proceed as planned, with Richard announcing his retirement for personal reasons while I would be introduced as interim chairperson pending formal leadership succession planning. The Adler Properties headquarters looked impossibly different as I approached it that afternoon. Not because the gleaming glass tower had changed, but because my relationship to it had transformed completely. For decades, I had entered this building as Richard's wife, a peripheral figure, occasionally attending company functions or joining executive dinners. Today, I arrived as the controlling shareholder prepared to assume formal leadership. The executive elevator whisked me directly to the 38th floor, where the boardroom occupied the prime corner position overlooking the city skyline. Eleanor walked beside me, her confident presence a reminder that this transition was not merely personal vindication, but a carefully orchestrated business restructuring. "The board members have all received the briefing documents," I confirmed as we approached the mahogany doors. "Delivered securely this morning," Eleanor nodded. 8 of the 11 have already acknowledged receipt and review. Based on preliminary responses, you have clear majority support for the transition plan. This confirmation settled the last whisper of uncertainty. While I had methodically built my ownership position and cultivated relationships with key board members, today would be the first explicit test of their willingness to accept my leadership after decades of Richard's unquestioned authority. The boardroom fell silent as we entered. 10 people sat around the massive table, with Richard conspicuously positioned at the head position he had occupied for 20 years. His expression remained carefully neutral, though the slight tightness around his eyes betrayed the strain of maintaining this facade. What surprised me was Melissa's presence, seated not at the administrative position near the door, as would be appropriate for her role, but directly beside Richard in the space typically reserved for the CFO. Her youth appeared even more pronounced in this setting, surrounded by executives with decades of experience, yet her posture projected practiced confidence. "Victoria," Richard acknowledged with forced cordiality, "and Ms. Blackwell. We were just reviewing the quarterly projections while waiting." The deliberate attempt to frame this as a routine meeting rather than the leadership transition we all knew was coming represented Richard's last attempt to control the narrative. I smiled pleasantly while taking the open seat directly opposite him at the table's far end, not the peripheral position he likely expected me to choose. "Thank you all for accommodating this special session," I began, opening my portfolio deliberately. "As the briefing materials outlined, we're addressing significant governance transitions necessitated by recent developments." Before I could continue, Melissa leaned forward with a smile that appeared professionally warm, but couldn't quite conceal her underlying tension. "Before we begin, I wanted to introduce myself properly to those board members I haven't yet met personally. I'm Melissa Barrett, Senior Strategic Advisor to Mr. Adler and newly appointed Director of Corporate Development." The tactical move was immediately clear. Richard had apparently created a new executive title for Melissa overnight, attempting to solidify her position before the transition. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the transparent maneuver for what it was. "That's an interesting development," I replied calmly. especially since executive appointments require board governance committee approval, which doesn't appear on any recent meeting minutes. Marcus Jenkins, the longest-serving board member and former university colleague of Richard's, cleared his throat awkwardly. Richard mentioned a temporary special assignment this morning pending formal approval processes. I see. I met Richard's gaze directly across the table. Well, we can address reporting structures after resolving the primary agenda items. Eleanor, would you distribute the signed transition agreements? As Eleanor efficiently handed documents to each board member, Richard's attempt to seize control of the narrative collapsed. The materials clearly outlined his signed agreement to transition to emeritus status, while I assumed interim chairperson responsibilities effective immediately. As you can see, I continued, once everyone had received their copies, Richard has recognized that personal circumstances necessitate leadership restructuring to ensure company stability. We've developed a comprehensive transition plan that maintains operational continuity while initiating a formal succession planning process. Melissa's composed expression faltered as she scanned the documents, clearly seeing for the first time the details of Richard's diminished position. She turned to him with questioning eyes, but Richard kept his attention fixed firmly on the papers before him. Jennifer Chen, the newest board member and CEO of a major technology firm, spoke first. These terms appear remarkably generous given the circumstances. Richard's emeritus status with full benefits and continuing board observer privileges represents significant accommodation. Her framing, that the arrangement favored Richard rather than penalized him, skillfully established the tone for the discussion. As a widely respected executive who had joined our board just 6 months earlier, Jennifer's perspective carried particular weight with the other members. Richard recognized the shifting dynamic but attempted one final assertion of the authority he had wielded for decades. While I appreciate the consideration, I believe a more gradual transition would better serve company interests. Perhaps a 6-month co-leadership arrangement would— The signed agreements don't provide for that option, Eleanor interjected smoothly. And given the potential conflicts of interest created by recent personal developments, governance best practices strongly recommend immediate and clear leadership delineation. The professional phrasing thinly veiled the underlying reality. Richard's affair with his much younger employee had created an untenable corporate liability that required decisive resolution. The board members exchanged glances, corporate survival, instincts clearly overriding personal loyalties. Marcus Jenkins sighed heavily before addressing Richard directly. We've worked together for a long time, Richard, and I've always respected your business acumen. But this situation, he gestured vaguely toward Melissa, creates complications we can't ignore. The transition plan protects both your legacy and the company's stability. I recommend we implement it as presented. Melissa, suddenly recognizing how completely her position had collapsed, attempted to salvage something from the rapidly deteriorating situation. As someone who's worked closely with Richard on strategic initiatives, she began, her voice professionally modulated despite visible tension, I should note that several key client relationships are deeply personal connections that might be jeopardized by abrupt leadership changes. It was a calculated attempt to leverage fear of client defections, a legitimate business concern that might override governance considerations. I had anticipated this angle, however, and was prepared, with a response that would definitively end her influence in this discussion. That's precisely why we've prepared personalized communications for our top 20 clients to be delivered immediately following this meeting, I replied, removing another document from my portfolio. Additionally, I've arranged individual calls with the 7 strategic clients whose relationships you're likely referring to, Ms. Barrett, including Westridge Development and Hamilton Enterprises. Melissa's expression froze momentarily before she recovered her professional composure. The message was clear. I knew exactly which client relationships she had been involved with, undermining her implied threat of unique access or influence. The board vote that followed was merely a formality. The transition plan was approved unanimously, with Richard abstaining rather than opposing, a final concession to preserving at least the appearance of dignity. As the meeting concluded, board members approached me individually with congratulations that carried varying degrees of surprise at my previously unrecognized capabilities. I've always wondered about the structural innovations in our acquisition strategy, Jennifer Chen commented quietly as others filtered from the room. The elegance of those approaches seemed inconsistent with Richard's typically more aggressive style. I suspect I've been admiring your work without realizing it. Her perceptiveness was unsurprising given her own remarkable career trajectory. Richard has many strengths, I acknowledged diplomatically. But yes, the portfolio diversification framework and tiered acquisition financing approaches were primarily my contributions. I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss those strategies in detail sometime, she replied with genuine professional interest. Perhaps after the transition dust settles. This unexpected moment of authentic recognition from a respected peer, something I had rarely experienced during decades of behind-the-scenes contribution, felt more validating than the formal power transfer itself. The morning after the board meeting, I arrived at Adler Properties headquarters at precisely 7:30 a.m., a full hour before the executive team's regular briefing traditionally held in what had been Richard's office. For 3 decades, I had organized my schedule around my husband's corporate routine. Now, that office and the authority it represented were mine. As I stepped off the executive elevator, Patricia Delaney rose from her desk with an expression that revealed both professional composure and personal uncertainty. At 59, Patricia had been with the company almost as long as I'd been married to Richard, occupying the powerful gatekeeper position that controlled access to the CEO. "Good morning, Mrs. Adler," she greeted me with formal courtesy. "The executive team has been notified of the meeting location change. They'll be gathering in the main conference room rather than—" She hesitated momentarily. "Rather than your office as requested." My first executive decision had been deliberate, moving the initial leadership meeting from Richard's personal domain to neutral territory. The psychological message was clear. This wouldn't simply be Richard's company with a different person, sitting in his chair. This was a substantive transition to new leadership with its own distinct approach. "Thank you, Patricia," I replied warmly. "And please, after all these years, Victoria would be more appropriate now." Her professional reserve softened slightly. "Of course, Victoria. The briefing materials are prepared, and I've taken the liberty of adding the regional development assessments you requested yesterday." This small interaction illustrated the first subtle but significant shifts already occurring throughout the organization. Patricia, whose loyalty to Richard had been absolute for decades, was methodically transferring that institutional efficiency to the new leadership reality. Her capabilities hadn't changed, merely the direction in which they were applied. The TEAT executive team filtered into the conference room over the next 20 minutes. 8 division heads whose careers had developed entirely under Richard's leadership. Their expressions ranged from carefully neutral to openly curious as they took seats around the table. Most had interacted with me occasionally at company functions, but always as Richard's wife, never as a business authority. "Good morning." I began precisely at 8:30, opening the leather portfolio that had belonged to my mother. "Thank you for adjusting to the schedule changes on short notice. I recognize this transition raises natural questions about operational continuity and strategic direction." The conventional beginnings seemed to slightly relax their visible tension. Jennifer Chen had advised me during our evening call to acknowledge the uncertainty directly, rather than pretending it didn't exist. Wisdom that reflected her own experience with corporate transitions. "Before we address regular business matters, I want to establish 3 key principles for this interim leadership period," I continued. "First, operational decisions will remain with divisional leadership unless broader integration is required. Second, the executive team structure remains unchanged while performance assessments proceed. And third, all strategic initiatives currently Underway continue without disruption pending formal review. The message was clear. This would be evolution, not revolution. Several executives visibly relaxed at this assurance that their immediate authority remained intact. Jonathan Miller, the veteran CFO who had worked alongside Richard for over 15 years, spoke first. "Victoria, if I may call you that in this context, will you be maintaining the same reporting cadence and structure Richard established?" The question was practical, but also a subtle test of my familiarity with executive operations. The weekly divisional updates and monthly consolidated reviews will continue, I confirmed. However, I prefer comprehensive performance metrics rather than the selective highlights format. Patricia has the revised templates for distribution today. This specific knowledge of their reporting deficiencies, something Richard had allowed, to develop as executives learned to emphasize favorable data, sent a clear message. I wasn't entering this role with superficial understanding, but with detailed knowledge of their actual operations, including the informational gaps Richard had permitted. The 2-hour meeting proceeded with methodical efficiency. Each executive presented their critical updates. I asked targeted questions that demonstrated understanding of their divisional challenges, and we established clear next steps. By the session's conclusion, the initial wariness had evolved into cautious professional engagement. Not yet full acceptance, but a workable foundation. As the executives departed, Samantha Torres, our head of international operations and the youngest member of the leadership team, lingered behind. Once the room had cleared, she approached with measured respect. "I wanted to say something that might be inappropriate in the larger setting," she began carefully. "The Phoenix development strategy, the one Richard has been pushing against for the past year. That original framework was your work, wasn't it?" The question surprised me. That particular strategy, a measured market entry I had developed based on demographic projections rather than immediate profit potential, had been dismissed by Richard as overly cautious despite its long-term advantages. "What makes you think that?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perception. "The approach was different," she explained, more nuanced in its understanding of demographic shifts and cultural considerations. Richard's strategies typically emphasized rapid market penetration and immediate visibility. This plan valued sustainability and incremental community integration. It felt like different thinking. Her perception was remarkably astute. "Yes, the original framework was my work," I acknowledged, though it was presented through appropriate channels rather than direct attribution. "I suspected as much," she nodded. "Some of us have occasionally wondered about the inconsistencies in our strategic approaches, moments of sophisticated cultural insight alongside more aggressive positioning. It makes more sense now." This unexpected recognition from a younger executive suggested that my behind-the-scenes influence had been more visible to perceptive observers than Richard had ever realized. As Samantha departed with a respectful nod, I felt a moment of validation that transcended the formal authority transition. My distinct business thinking had been recognizable even when deliberately obscured. My first week as interim chairperson unfolded with similar moments of revelation and recalibration. Executives accustomed to Richard's decisive but often impulsive leadership style adjusted to my more methodical approach. Middle managers who had learned to present selectively edited information discovered I expected comprehensive analysis. The message spread. This wasn't merely a titular change, but a substantive shift in leadership philosophy. Melissa Barrett's response to the new reality took an unexpected turn. Rather than resigning immediately as many anticipated, she requested the Denver transfer option, effectively removing herself from headquarters while maintaining employment. The decision reflected practical career preservation. At 29, with limited executive experience, her professional options were significantly better within the company than attempting to restart elsewhere with the complicated narrative of her relationship with Richard. Richard himself remained nominally connected through his emeritus status, though he had not appeared at headquarters since the transition announcement. According to Eleanor, he had established temporary residence at his condominium in Palm Springs, physical distance that paralleled his removal from operational authority. Whether Melissa had accompanied him remained unclear and deliberately outside my concern. The most significant early challenge emerged 10 days into my leadership when Hamilton Enterprises, our second-largest client and one Richard had personally cultivated for over a decade, requested an urgent meeting to discuss relationship continuity under the new organizational structure. The implied uncertainty about maintaining their business under my leadership represented the first major test of client confidence. Jennifer Chen offered strategic advice during our now regular evening calls. Client uncertainty following leadership. Transitions is normal, she observed from her own CEO experience, especially with relationships Richard deliberately personalized to enhance his perceived indispensability. Hamilton is particularly concerning, I acknowledged. They represent nearly 14% of annual revenue, and Richard intentionally limited access to their executive team, which creates both challenge and opportunity, Jennifer noted with characteristic insight. They're expecting to meet someone unfamiliar with their business, giving you the chance to decisively reset expectations by demonstrating deeper understanding than they anticipate. Following her advice, I spent the weekend immersed in Hamilton's complete account history, not just the summary reports Richard had presented to the board, but the detailed implementation documentation, financial structures, and service evaluations. By Monday morning, I had developed a comprehensive understanding, far exceeding the superficial familiarity they would expect from Richard's previously invisible wife. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning, with Hamilton's CEO, Robert Hamilton, and CFO Thomas Wright traveling to our headquarters, a power move suggesting they viewed themselves as the dominant party in our recalibrated relationship. I deliberately selected the main boardroom rather than the intimate conversation space Richard had always used for client meetings, subtly establishing that this discussion would proceed on my terms rather than theirs. When they arrived, Patricia escorted them to the boardroom where I waited with Jonathan Miller, our CFO, and Samantha Torres, whose international expertise was relevant to Hamilton's expansion ambitions. The subtle message was clear. They weren't meeting with an isolated and uncertain new leader, but with a cohesive executive team. "Gentlemen, welcome," I greeted them with professional warmth. "I understand you have questions about our continuing relationship under the leadership transition." Robert Hamilton, a man approximately Richard's age who had built his career in the same era of male-dominated commercial real estate, made minimal effort to conceal his skepticism. "Victoria, I hope. I may call you that. This is obviously a significant change from our long-standing relationship with Richard. We've built considerable business together based on mutual understanding of market dynamics." The implied concern was typical, that Richard's departure meant loss of the executive relationship they valued, necessitating either their departure to follow him or significant concessions to maintain their business. Their negotiating position assumed my desperation to retain their account would create leverage they could exploit. "Indeed, our companies have built substantial mutual value," I agreed pleasantly, "which is why I wanted to address your Southwest expansion concerns before they became more pressing." The statement, referencing internal challenges they hadn't mentioned publicly, visibly startled both men. Their CFO recovered first. "You're familiar with our international structure?" "Not just familiar, but concerned about the potential zoning complications with your current approach," I replied, opening my portfolio to reference specific details. "The mixed-use designation's recent modifications create unnecessary exposure under the revised environmental compliance framework taking effect next quarter. We've developed an alternative structure that maintains operational flexibility while reducing regulatory risk by approximately 38%. The substantive analysis, addressing problems they hadn't even raised yet, completely reset the conversation's dynamic. Rather than an obligatory courtesy meeting with Richard's replacement, they found themselves engaged with someone possessing deeper understanding of their business challenges than Richard had ever demonstrated. For the next 2 hours, we discussed detailed aspects of their business operations, regulatory compliance considerations, and strategic positioning. With each exchange, their initial skepticism visibly transformed into genuine professional engagement. By the meeting's conclusion, Robert Hamilton's tone had shifted from condescending evaluation to collegial problem-solving. "I'll be direct, Victoria," he said as we concluded. "We came here expecting to begin transition planning to another provider. Richard had assured us his personal involvement was essential to your company's service model. Clearly, we were misinformed about where the actual expertise resided." The candid acknowledgement represented more than client retention. It was explicit recognition that Richard had deliberately cultivated dependencies to enhance his perceived value while obscuring my contributions. As they departed with renewed commitments rather than termination plans, I recognized this interaction would repeat with other key relationships Richard had personalized to magnify his own importance. Each successful retention would further stabilize the company while confirming my leadership legitimacy. As my third week of leadership began, patterns emerged that reflected both organizational recalibration and personal vindication. Executives, who had initially approached me with cautious formality, began bringing substantive challenges directly to my attention, discovering that my insights often resolved long-standing issues Richard had left unaddressed. Mid-level managers, particularly women who had struggled for recognition, found more receptive consideration of their perspectives than had been possible under previous leadership. 1 month into my tenure, I was reviewing quarterly projections. Late one evening when Jonathan Miller requested an urgent meeting, his typically composed demeanor showed unusual strain as he entered my office carrying a leather portfolio similar to the one my mother had given me decades earlier. "I found something concerning," Jonathan began without preamble, placing several documents on my desk. Something Richard had compartmentalized outside normal reporting structures. The materials detailed a troubled acquisition Richard had personally championed 18 months earlier. Adler Properties, a commercial development firm that complemented our portfolio, but had been performing significantly below projected targets. What made this situation unusual wasn't the underperformance itself, but the elaborate reporting structure Richard had created to obscure the actual results. The official board updates show Meridian meeting 82% of integration targets, Jonathan explained, pointing to familiar reports I'd seen at quarterly reviews. But these internal assessments tell a completely different story. They're actually achieving below 45% of projections while burning through capital at an unsustainable rate. As I examined the documentation, the magnitude of the concealment became clear. Richard had created a reporting firewall with adjusted figures presented to the board and executive team, while the actual performance data remained restricted to a small implementation group sworn to confidentiality. The deception wasn't merely misleading. It represented potential securities violations given our public company status. "How did you discover this?" I asked, noting the restricted server locations referenced in the document footers. "Samantha found anomalies in international fund transfers related to Meridian's overseas development centers," Jonathan explained. When standard access channels didn't provide explanations, she approached me directly, rather than going through traditional reporting lines. Together, we obtained authorized access to the restricted documentation based on financial compliance requirements. This revelation illustrated how quickly the organization's culture was evolving under my leadership. Under Richard, such independent investigation would have been considered overstepping, with executives expected to accept the information they were given rather than pursuing inconsistencies. The fact that Samantha and Jonathan had felt empowered to investigate and then bring their findings directly to me represented meaningful organizational change just weeks into my tenure. "This requires immediate action," I noted, quickly assessing the implications both to address the business situation and to correct the reporting violations before they became legally problematic. Richard was personally handling the turnaround strategy, Jonathan added carefully. He'd scheduled quarterly site visits that no one else attended, insisting he alone understood the necessary intervention approach. The situation crystallized Richard's leadership limitations in stark relief. Rather than acknowledging a strategic misstep and leveraging the executive team's collective expertise to address it, he had concealed the problem to protect his reputation as an infallible business leader. This pattern of prioritizing personal image over organizational health had clearly extended beyond his relationship with me to infect his corporate leadership approach. We'll need to conduct a comprehensive assessment immediately, I decided, scanning the troubling Meridian Properties documents Jonathan had presented. Please assemble a small intervention team with appropriate expertise, full operational transparency, but contained to essential personnel until we understand the complete situation. And the board? Jonathan asked, his expression reflecting the gravity of the discovery. They've been receiving inaccurate information for over a year. We'll prepare a full disclosure for the next meeting, I replied. With a detailed intervention plan already in development to accompany the revelation, Jennifer Chen's development background will be particularly valuable in evaluating realistic recovery options. The Meridian crisis consumed the next 2 weeks. Our assessment team discovered a situation far worse than even the hidden reports had indicated. Beyond performance issues, there were significant integration failures, local community opposition to development plans, and construction delays that threatened contractual obligations with major tenants. The morning before the emergency board, meeting where we would disclose the full situation, I received an unexpected call from Eleanor. Richard has requested a private meeting, she informed me. He says it's regarding mutual interests that require immediate discussion. The timing suggested he had somehow learned about our Meridian investigation, likely through remaining connections within the company. While my first instinct was to refuse any meeting outside formal channels, strategic consideration suggested potential value in understanding his perspective before the board disclosure. I'll meet him at the Lakeshore Club, I decided, naming a private business venue where discretion was assured. This afternoon, 2 Ba'a. Please make it clear this is a one-time accommodation for specific business purposes only. The Lakeshore Club had been Richard's domain throughout our marriage, the exclusive space where he conducted his most sensitive business discussions and cultivated relationships with other executives. I had visited only occasionally for formal functions, always as his accessory, rather than a member in my own right. Now I entered as the controlling shareholder and chairperson of Adler Properties, with the membership recently transferred to my name. Richard waited in a private meeting room, his appearance noticeably different after just 5 weeks away from the company. The impeccable corporate presence he had maintained for decades had softened slightly, his hair less precisely trimmed, his clothing still professional, but lacking the meticulous perfection he had always demanded. Whether these changes reflected deliberate relaxation into early retirement or the impact of diminished status remained unclear. Victoria, he acknowledged with careful neutrality. Thank you for agreeing to meet. You mentioned mutual interests requiring discussion, I replied, taking the seat opposite him. I assume this concerns Meridian Properties. The direct reference visibly surprised him, confirming my suspicion about the meeting's purpose. You know about the situation, he stated rather than asked. The actual situation? Yes, I confirmed. Not the manufactured narrative presented in official reports. Richard's expression tightened. Those reporting structures were designed to provide time for implementation of the turnaround strategy without creating unnecessary concern. Those reporting structures constituted deliberate misrepresentation to the board and potentially violated securities regulations, I corrected. The company is now exposed to significant legal and financial risk because you prioritized appearing infallible over responsible corporate governance. The blunt assessment hung between us, challenging the leadership mythology he had constructed over decades. After a moment, he sighed heavily, a rare acknowledgement of error I had seldom witnessed during our marriage. The acquisition was meant to be transformative, he said finally, positioning us for mixed-use development that would elevate the entire portfolio. The implementation challenges emerged after commitment, but I believed they were solvable with the right approach. Which might have been true if you'd engaged the collective expertise of the executive team rather than imposing isolated control, I noted. Instead, you created an information silo that prevented actual solution development while the situation deteriorated. The observation struck at the core of Richard's leadership philosophy. That centralized control in the hands of a singular authority, himself, produced optimal outcomes. The Meridian disaster directly contradicted this belief, demonstrating how his approach had created vulnerable blind spots with significant consequences. The board disclosure is scheduled for tomorrow, I continued when he didn't immediately respond. We'll present both the actual situation and the comprehensive intervention plan already in development. Your presence isn't required, but would be appropriate given your direct involvement in both the acquisition and the reporting irregularities. Richard processed this information with visible calculation, weighing how his attendance might affect perception versus absence. What does the intervention plan entail? He asked finally. A complete restructuring of the integration approach, I explained. Leadership changes at Meridian, revised development timelines with tenant transparency, negotiated modifications to community elements, and implementation of proper reporting structures. Jennifer Chen is personally involved given her development sector expertise. The mention of Jennifer's involvement seemed to finally penetrate Richard's remaining confidence in his indispensability. As one of the most respected real estate executives in the region, her direct engagement signaled commitment to actual resolution rather than image management. I'll attend, he decided after consideration. It's my responsibility to address this directly. The acknowledgement represented subtle but significant personal growth. Rather than deflecting accountability or attempting to control the narrative, he was accepting responsibility for his decisions, a standard I had rarely seen him apply to personal or professional missteps during our 30 years together. The board meeting the following day marked a pivotal moment in the company's evolution. With Richard present but seated among regular members rather than in his former position of authority, I led the executive team through a comprehensive disclosure of the Meridian situation, including both the performance realities and the reporting irregularities that had concealed them. Marcus Jenkins, Richard's longest-serving board ally, asked the question everyone was considering. How did this level of misreporting continue undetected through multiple review cycles? Rather than focusing blame directly on Richard, I addressed the structural issues that had enabled the situation. The previous leadership model centralized certain decisions with limited accountability mechanisms. Information flows were structured to concentrate control rather than ensure comprehensive oversight. Those governance weaknesses have been identified and addressed in our revised protocols. This approach, acknowledging the failures while focusing on systemic corrections rather than personal condemnation, set a tone that allowed productive discussion rather than defensive positioning. When Richard spoke, acknowledging his direct responsibility for both the acquisition strategy and the reporting approach, the moment reflected meaningful organizational maturation. The Meridian Intervention Plan represents our new leadership philosophy in action, I explained as we transitioned to solution development. Collaborative expertise engagement, transparent assessment regardless of impact on previous decisions, and accountable execution through clear milestone tracking. The comprehensive strategy our team presented, developed in just 2 weeks compared to Richard's 18 months of ineffective isolated management, demonstrated the tangible advantages of this revised approach. Jennifer Chen's market expertise had identified viable development path corrections, while Samantha Torres had developed innovative community engagement structures that addressed the local opposition Richard had never fully recognized. As the meeting concluded with unanimous board approval of our intervention strategy, I noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in how members engaged with me versus Richard. Where they had previously directed technical questions to him while offering me social pleasantries, they now engaged directly with my strategic perspective, while treating Richard with respectful but diminished deference. In the following days, our Meridian intervention team began implementing the approved strategy. The immediate transparency with affected tenants, an approach Richard had resisted, yielded surprising benefits as several major clients offered flexibility on occupancy, timelines in exchange for direct involvement in design reprioritization. Rather than damaging these relationships as Richard had feared, honest disclosure actually strengthened them through demonstrated commitment to substantive solution development, rather than surface-level impression management. 3 weeks into the Meridian restructuring, early indicators suggested promising improvement. Construction milestone achievement had increased 52%. Tenant retention had stabilized after months of accelerating departures, and local community resistance had diminished following our revised development approach that incorporated many of their concerns. The situation remained challenging, but the trajectory had clearly shifted from deteriorating crisis to managed turnaround. This visible success with a problem Richard couldn't solve despite months of isolated effort carried significance. Beyond the specific business challenge throughout the organization, it tangibly demonstrated that my leadership approach, collaborative expertise engagement, transparent assessment, and accountable execution could resolve even inherited crises more effectively than Richard's command and control methodology. Tatuti dai. Contrast became particularly meaningful for the women within our organization who had previously struggled for recognition under Richard's leadership. Seeing a woman in her late 60s successfully address a crisis the charismatic male leader couldn't resolve challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about authority, expertise, and leadership capability. Across departments, female managers reported increasing receptiveness to their perspectives in meetings, more equitable distribution of high-visibility assignments, and greater acknowledgement of their contributions. One afternoon, approximately 2 months after assuming leadership, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. The executive assistant announced that my granddaughter Sophia had arrived. At 23, Sophia was completing her MBA at the same business school I had attended decades earlier. Though we had always been close, her unscheduled appearance at headquarters was unusual. "Grandma," she greeted me warmly as she entered, her professional attire suggesting she had come directly from her graduate internship at a consulting firm across town. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything crucial." "Never too busy for you," I assured her, genuinely pleased by the surprise visit. "What brings you downtown?" "I've been following the company news," she explained, taking a seat across from my desk. "The Meridian turnaround strategy has become a case study in my corporate governance seminar. Professor Winters is using it to illustrate effective crisis management approaches." This was unexpected information. "The Meridian situation is being taught at the business school?" Sophia nodded, her expression brightening with pride. "As an example of how collaborative leadership can resolve crises that autocratic approaches cannot." The professor specifically highlighted how the transparent assessment process revealed solutions that had been overlooked under isolated decision-making. The notion that our internal management approach had already attracted academic attention was surprising, a reminder that corporate transformations rarely remain completely private in professional communities that value innovation. "There's something else?" Sophia continued, her tone shifting to something more personal. When the professor mentioned the chairperson who implemented the turnaround strategy was a woman who had previously been underestimated, I realized she was talking about you. It made me think about our conversations over the years. "What conversations?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "All those times you advised me about building expertise that speaks for itself, documenting my contributions carefully, and creating value that transcends recognition," she explained. I always thought it was general career wisdom. Now I understand. You were teaching me strategies you'd developed through your own experience. Her insight created an unexpected moment of connection across generations. The practical approaches I had cultivated through necessity were being transmitted as deliberate wisdom rather than defensive adaptation. The business world has changed substantially since my early career, I noted. Many of the overt barriers I faced have diminished. But not disappeared, Sophia countered with perceptiveness beyond her years. The dynamics have evolved, but the underlying patterns persist. Your strategies are still relevant, perhaps even more valuable now because they're less expected. Building substantive capability while others focus on visibility still creates advantages they don't anticipate. As our conversation continued, I recognized something profound occurring: the transformation of survival mechanisms into intentional frameworks for the next generation. What I had developed as necessary adaptation to systematic marginalization, Sophia was receiving as strategic methodology to be consciously deployed. There's a group of women in my program discussing these approaches, she explained. We're examining how building foundation before facade creates more sustainable career trajectories than the personal branding emphasis that dominates current business culture. Foundation before facade, I repeated, appreciating the concise framing. That captures the essence perfectly. Professor Winters has invited guest speakers for our leadership series, Sophia said carefully. Given the Meridian case study, she wondered if you might consider sharing your perspective on collaborative crisis resolution. The invitation represented an unexpected opportunity to transform private experience into public wisdom, precisely what I had avoided throughout my career until circumstances forced me into visibility. The reflexive inclination to decline was strong, yet something in Sophia's expectant expression made me reconsider. Perhaps it's time to share these approaches. More explicitly, I acknowledged. Not just the business strategies, but the patient positioning that enabled them. 6 months after taking control of Adler Properties, I stood at the podium in the Grand Lecture Hall of Westlake Business School, the very institution where I had earned my finance degree nearly 45 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that I now addressed the executive leadership seminar as an exemplary case study, rather than the marginalized figure I had been for decades. Strategic patience isn't passivity, I explained to the room of 80 graduate students and faculty members. It's the deliberate cultivation of capability while recognizing that visibility and recognition may lag significantly behind value creation. In environments where attribution is unevenly distributed, documentation becomes essential not just for eventual credit, but for your own confidence in challenging underestimation. Professor Helen Winters, who had extended the invitation through Sophia, nodded approvingly from the side of the stage. At 64, she had built her academic reputation on research examining leadership effectiveness across diverse management approaches, making her particularly receptive to the methodologies I had developed through necessity rather than formal theory. Could you elaborate on how you maintained this strategic patience during periods when your contributions went unrecognized? She asked, directing the Q&A portion toward practical application. Many professionals struggle with sustaining motivation when their work is systematically attributed to others. The question struck at the emotional core of my experience, something I had rarely articulated even to myself during those years of building beneath the surface. I developed what I now call private scorecards, I explained, detailed records of initiatives I had conceptualized, problems I had solved, and value I had created. These weren't for external validation, but for personal truth, concrete evidence that counterbalanced public narratives. When Richard would receive accolades for strategic innovations I had designed, my private documentation provided an anchor to reality that prevented self-doubt from corroding my confidence. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Wasn't it difficult to remain patient for so many years? 30 years is an extraordinary time frame for strategic positioning. The patience wasn't passive waiting, I clarified. Each year contained active capability building and incremental position strengthening. The Monarch Ventures ownership structure grew consistently through deliberate transactions that improved my leverage regardless of whether recognition ever came. The patience was in not forcing premature confrontation before my position was unassailable. This reframing of patience as active preparation rather than passive endurance resonated visibly with the audience. Several students were taking detailed notes, while others nodded in recognition of a concept that clarified their own experiences. The session concluded and students approached with individual questions. I noticed Richard standing at the back of the lecture hall. His presence was unexpected. We had maintained minimal contact since the Meridian crisis resolution, interacting only through attorneys regarding our now finalized divorce and through formal board communications in his emeritus role. When the last student departed, he approached the podium with an expression I couldn't immediately interpret. Neither the defensive hostility I might have expected, nor the false charm he had often deployed in uncomfortable situations. "That was illuminating," he said simply. "After 30 years, I'm still discovering aspects of your thinking I never fully appreciated." The acknowledgement, delivered without obvious agenda, seemed to reflect genuine reflection rather than strategic positioning. Academic settings encourage explicit articulation of approaches that were previously implicit, I replied neutrally, gathering my presentation materials while maintaining professional composure. Your discussion of documentation as both protection and validation was particularly insightful, he continued. It explains organizational systems I previously viewed as excessive caution, but now recognize as deliberate safeguards against marginalization. His observation suggested an unexpected level of self-awareness, recognition that the excessive documentation he had often dismissed had actually been a necessary adaptation to the attribution imbalance he had fostered. "What brings you to campus today?" I asked, genuinely curious about his presence at my presentation. "The business school asked me to contribute to their Entrepreneur Archive project," he explained. "Recorded interviews with regional business founders. Given recent developments, I insisted they include you as well. Your perspective is clearly the more valuable one for students interested in sustainable leadership approaches." The recommendation represented a significant evolution from the man who had systematically minimized my contributions throughout our marriage and professional relationship. Whether this reflected genuine growth or pragmatic adaptation to new realities remained unclear, but the outcome was meaningful, regardless of motivation. As we walked together toward the building exit, an unexpected question formed in my mind. One I had never considered during the decades of working in his shadow, or the months of establishing my independent leadership. "Do you regret it?" I asked, the ambiguity intentional. Richard paused, considering the layered question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. "The easy answer would be regretting not reading the documents that transferred control," he replied with surprising candor. "But the more honest one is regretting the years of not recognizing the strategic mind operating alongside mine, treating as secondary the very capabilities that built our most successful frameworks." His response contained no mention of Melissa or our personal relationship, an omission that itself revealed how completely professional recognition had superseded romantic considerations in our complex dynamic. The acknowledgement of my strategic capability rather than simply expressing personal remorse suggested evolution beyond self-interest to actual comprehension. "We built something substantial together," I acknowledged, offering limited reconciliation, without relinquishing the clarity about our respective contributions, though with significantly different understandings of our relative roles. "Understandings you've decisively corrected," he noted with resignation that carried no evident bitterness. "The company's performance under your explicit leadership rather than hidden influence speaks for itself." This reference to Adler Properties' remarkable results since my assumption of control reflected undeniable reality. The stock value had increased 28% in 6 months, driven by the successful Meridian turnaround, improved operational transparency, and market confidence in our collaborative leadership approach. What Richard had failed to achieve through autocratic control, the integrated expertise model I had implemented was delivering consistently. As we reached the campus plaza, we encountered Professor Winters escorting Sophia from another building. The unexpected family tableau, my granddaughter, my former husband, and myself in this academic setting that had shaped both my early career and Sophia's current development, created a moment of peculiar symmetry across generations. Grandpa. Richard! Sophia greeted him with genuine warmth that transcended the corporate complications. Despite the dissolution of our marriage, his relationship with our grandchildren remained important to both him and them. A personal connection I had been careful to preserve despite professional recalibration. I've been shadowing Professor Torres in the real estate development program, she explained enthusiastically. Her analysis of integrated community planning models is revolutionary. Professor Torres? Richard questioned, momentarily confused. Samantha accepted an adjunct position in the graduate program last month, I explained, teaching advanced development strategy while maintaining her international operations role at Adler. Her academic appointment has already strengthened our university recruitment pipeline. This information, that the youngest member of our executive team was now establishing academic credibility alongside her corporate responsibilities, represented another evolution of the leadership culture I had fostered. Where Richard had maintained rigid boundaries between business operations and external engagement, I had encouraged overlapping spheres that created multiple value streams. As Sophia and Richard began discussing her graduate research, Professor Winters drew me aside with a thoughtful expression. Your presentation today generated exceptional engagement, she noted, but I suspect you've only shared the corporate applications of your strategic patience approach, not its personal dimensions. Her perception was remarkably accurate. I had deliberately focused on the business aspects of my methodology, avoiding the emotional complexities that had accompanied decades of systematic underestimation. The personal dimensions remain more challenging to articulate, I acknowledged. Maintaining confidence while being consistently undervalued requires psychological strategies I'm still working to formalize. Those psychological components are precisely what our Women's Leadership Initiative aims to address, she explained. The internal resource development that sustains external capability building. We're assembling a symposium for next semester, focusing on these resilience frameworks. Your perspective would be invaluable. The invitation represented an opportunity to transform private coping mechanisms into explicit methodologies that might benefit others, facing similar challenges, particularly younger women navigating evolved but persistent barriers. I'd like to develop that aspect more systematically, I agreed, perhaps with structured interviews of other women who've implemented similar approaches in different contexts. This research orientation, treating my experience as one data point in a broader pattern rather than an exceptional narrative, reflected my growing recognition that my journey contained transferable principles beyond its specific circumstances. What had been survival adaptations could become deliberate strategies when properly codified and contextually applied. As we prepared to leave campus, Sophia's phone chimed with a message that prompted a broad smile. The Adler Foundation proposal was approved, she announced excitedly. Full funding for the Women's Business Incubator program. This referenced a project I had initiated 2 months earlier, establishing a separate charitable foundation funded by a portion of Adler Properties' annual profits. The foundation's first major initiative was creating business development resources specifically designed for women entrepreneurs with limited access to traditional funding networks. Excellent, I responded, genuinely pleased by this expansion of influence beyond corporate boundaries. Has Sandra confirmed as program director? She starts next month, Sophia confirmed. Her experience with microfinance models brings exactly the perspective we need for the mentorship framework. Sandra Chen, Jennifer's daughter and a recognized expert in emerging market development, had agreed to lead the foundation's flagship program, creating an intergenerational leadership network that extended our impact far beyond Adler Properties' immediate operations. This deliberate cultivation of capability across organizational boundaries represented the logical evolution of the principles I had developed through necessity. As Richard observed this exchange, something in his expression shifted, a recognition perhaps that the leadership approach he had systematically marginalized was now generating value streams he had never envisioned during his tenure as CEO. The foundation, the academic partnerships, the integrated development methodologies, all represented expansions beyond traditional corporate boundaries towards sustainable ecosystem building. "You've created something remarkable, Victoria," he acknowledged with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "Not just corrected company deficiencies, but developed entirely new value dimensions I never considered. The validation coming from the person who had most consistently dismissed my strategic thinking carried a certain ironic satisfaction. Yet I found myself less invested in his acknowledgement than I might have expected. My confidence now derived from observable impact rather than external validation, precisely the internal resource Professor Winters had referenced. 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected package at my office. Inside was a framed photograph I had never seen before, a candid image from our company's 5th anniversary celebration, capturing me in animated conversation with our first major investors. My expression reflected intense engagement as I apparently explained complex financial projections, while Richard stood slightly outside the frame, watching with an expression combining pride and something that, in retrospect, might have been uncertainty. A note accompanied the photograph in Richard's distinctive handwriting, found while organizing old files, evidence of the capability that was always present while I was focused elsewhere. "The company is where it belongs, in the hands of its true strategic architect." The acknowledgement, delivered privately rather than as public performance, suggested genuine recalibration rather than strategic positioning. Whether through counseling, personal reflection, or simple recognition of demonstrable results, Richard appeared to have evolved beyond the reflexive diminishment that had characterized our decades together. I placed the photograph on my credenza, rather than prominently displaying it, not as central validation but as historical documentation of a journey now bearing fruit in dimensions extending far beyond that early moment. The true satisfaction came not from Richard's belated recognition, but from the tangible impact of the leadership approach I had developed despite his consistent underestimation. 1 year after assuming control of Adler Properties, I sat in my office reviewing quarterly projections with a satisfaction that transcended mere financial metrics. The company hadn't just survived the leadership transition and Meridian crisis, it was thriving under the new collaborative management approach in ways that challenged many long-held assumptions about effective corporate governance. The Meridian turnaround had become a case study in effective crisis management. What Richard had failed to resolve through 18 months of isolated control, our collaborative team had substantially corrected in just 5 months. The property development was now meeting 86% of revised performance targets, with tenant satisfaction metrics showing steady improvement and community opposition transformed into engaged partnership. More significant than the specific business, recovery was how the process had catalyzed broader organizational transformation. Executives who had operated in protective silos under Richard's leadership now regularly engaged in cross-functional problem-solving. Middle managers previously hesitant to identify concerns for fear of being labeled negative now received recognition for surfacing issues early with potential solution approaches. Throughout the company, a culture of transparent assessment and collaborative resolution was replacing the image management and hierarchical control that had characterized Richard's era. The measurable results, improved project completion rates, reduced employee turnover, increased innovation metrics, provided empirical validation of approaches I had advocated for decades without recognition. As I reviewed the latest performance data, a series of calendar notifications appeared on my screen. Reminders of the expanding spheres my influence now encompassed. Tomorrow's executive leadership meeting would include 3 recently promoted women who had previously been overlooked, despite exceptional capabilities. Friday's board session would review the Adler Foundation's initial program results. Next week's business school symposium would feature my presentation on strategic documentation as professional leverage. Each notification represented a dimension of influence I had carefully cultivated from the foundation I had built beneath the surface for 30 years, a foundation that now supported visible leadership extending far beyond conventional corporate boundaries. The patient strategy my mother had taught me so many years ago had created a position strong enough not just to withstand personal betrayal, but to transform organizational culture after decades of systematic marginalization. Richard's decision to leave me for his young assistant had been merely the catalyst that triggered the revelation of power structures I had methodically constructed throughout our marriage. The expression on his face when he discovered the truth about Adler Properties' ownership would remain a satisfying memory. But the true vindication lay in the thriving organization now explicitly shaped by the very approaches he had consistently dismissed. The quiet, strategic patience I had cultivated through necessity had ultimately proven more powerful than the charismatic authority he had wielded so confidently. While he had focused on appearance, I had built substance. While he had accumulated accolades, I had accumulated ownership. The company now reflected my long-hidden vision, not because circumstances had forced a reluctant transition, but because that vision had always been the stronger foundation beneath the visible facade. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.